The desert sun burned down on the Rocky Mountains of Afghanistan as Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison checked his watch. His SEAL team had been moving through the dangerous territory for 6 hours, tracking a high-value target who had been planning attacks on American forces. The intelligence was solid, but the mission was taking longer than expected. Morrison's team of 8 elite Navy SEALs had been dropped into the remote valley before dawn. Their target was Ahmed Nazir, a bomb maker who had killed dozens of coalition soldiers with his deadly devices. The man was hiding in a compound deep in Taliban territory, surrounded by hostile fighters who would shoot any American on sight. The team moved carefully through the narrow mountain paths, using hand signals to communicate. Petty Officer Sarah Chen, the team's communications specialist, stayed close to Morrison while scanning for enemy radio chatter. Behind them, the rest of the team spread out in tactical formation, their weapons ready for any threat. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Morrison felt something was wrong. The area was too quiet. In hostile territory like this, there should be more activity. Goat herders, farmers, or at least some signs of life. But the valleys below them were empty, and no birds sang in the rocky cliffs above. Chen suddenly grabbed Morrison's arm and pointed to her radio equipment. She had picked up enemy communications on the Taliban frequency. Through her headphones, she could hear rapid Arabic being spoken by multiple voices. The tone was urgent, almost excited. She quickly translated the key words for Morrison: Americans, trapped, and kill. Morrison's blood ran cold. The Taliban knew they were coming. This wasn't just a routine mission anymore. It was becoming a deadly trap. He immediately signaled for the team to take cover behind the large boulders scattered across the mountainside. Looking through his binoculars, Morrison could see the compound where their target was hiding. It sat on a flat area between 2 mountain peaks, with only one narrow path leading to it. The building looked innocent enough, just a simple stone structure with a few outbuildings. But Morrison's trained eye noticed something troubling. There were too many men moving around the compound. The intelligence had said Nazir would have maybe 5 or 6 guards, but Morrison could count at least 20 fighters taking positions around the building. Some were carrying rocket-propelled grenades, while others had heavy machine guns. This wasn't just a hideout, it was a fortress. Chen continued monitoring the radio traffic, and her face grew more worried with each message she intercepted. The Taliban weren't just waiting for the SEALs to attack. They had been planning this ambush for days. Somehow, the enemy had learned about the mission and turned it into a trap. Morrison realized they had walked into what the military calls a kill box, a carefully prepared area where the enemy has overwhelming firepower and multiple escape routes blocked. The Taliban fighters had positioned themselves on the high ground all around the compound, giving them clear shots at anyone trying to approach or retreat. The situation got worse when Chen picked up another radio transmission. Taliban reinforcements were already moving up the mountain paths behind them, cutting off their escape route. Morrison's team was now caught between the heavily defended compound ahead and enemy fighters closing in from behind. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the mountainside, Morrison knew his team was in serious trouble. They were outnumbered at least 4 to 1, trapped in hostile territory with no easy way out. The mission to capture Ahmed Nazir had become a fight for survival. Morrison gathered his team leaders and quickly explained the situation. They had 3 options: try to fight their way out immediately while they still had some daylight, wait for darkness and attempt to sneak past the enemy positions, or call for backup and risk exposing other American forces to the same trap. The decision wasn't easy, but Morrison knew what he had to do. His team was trained for situations exactly like this, but they would need help to survive the night. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Morrison made the call that would change everything. Morrison pulled out his satellite communication device and began transmitting an emergency distress call. The message was coded but clear. His team was surrounded and needed immediate extraction or support. He included their exact coordinates and the number of enemy fighters they were facing. At the coalition forces base 60 miles away, the distress signal came through loud and clear. The duty officer immediately woke up Colonel Martinez, the base commander, who had been sleeping after a long day of planning operations. Martinez read the message twice, his face growing grim as he understood the situation. The problem was that Morrison's team was too far away for a quick helicopter rescue. The nearest attack helicopters were on another mission, and it would take at least 3 hours to get them redirected to Morrison's position. By then, the SEALs would likely be overrun or forced to fight their way through superior numbers. Martinez called an emergency meeting with his staff officers. They spread out detailed maps of the area and began looking for any assets that could help the trapped SEAL team. The base had some drone support, but the drones were unarmed and could only provide intelligence. They had artillery, but it was too far away to be effective at Morrison's location. One young intelligence officer suggested something unusual. He had been tracking the movement of a lone American sniper who had been operating independently in the same mountain region for the past 2 weeks. The sniper wasn't part of any official unit and had been working alone on classified missions. Martinez had heard rumors about this mysterious sniper, but had never received any official reports. According to the intelligence files, the man was a former Marine scout sniper named Marcus Rodriguez, who had volunteered for an experimental solo reconnaissance program. His mission was to gather intelligence on Taliban supply routes, but he had also been eliminating high-value targets when the opportunity arose. The problem was that Rodriguez hadn't made contact with any coalition forces in over a week. His last known position was somewhere in the same mountain range where Morrison's team was trapped, but nobody knew exactly where he was or if he was still alive. Martinez made a difficult decision. He ordered his communications team to broadcast an emergency message on all military frequencies, hoping that Rodriguez was listening. The message was simple. American forces were trapped and needed immediate assistance from any friendly units in the area. Meanwhile, Morrison's situation was getting worse by the hour. Through their night vision equipment, the SEALs could see Taliban fighters moving closer to their position. The enemy was being careful, using the darkness and rocky terrain to advance without exposing themselves to return fire. Chen continued monitoring enemy radio traffic and reported that the Taliban commander was coordinating a 3-pronged attack. One group would assault the SEALs' position from the front, while 2 other groups would circle around both sides to prevent any escape. The attack was planned to begin just after midnight, when the Taliban fighters would have the best night vision advantage. Morrison ordered his team to prepare defensive positions among the boulders. They set up overlapping fields of fire and placed their few remaining claymore mines at strategic choke points. Each SEAL checked their ammunition and equipment, knowing they would need every bullet in the coming fight. As 11 p.m. approached, Morrison could hear the enemy fighters calling to each other across the mountainside. The Taliban wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. They knew the Americans were trapped and were getting ready for the final assault. The sound of metal clicking against rock echoed through the darkness as weapons were loaded and safety switches flipped off. 10 miles away, hidden in a cave overlooking a different valley, Marcus Rodriguez heard the emergency broadcast on his field radio. He had been tracking a Taliban supply convoy when the distress call came through. Rodriguez immediately recognized the coordinates. He knew exactly where Morrison's team was trapped. Rodriguez faced a difficult choice. He could try to help the SEALs, but that would mean abandoning his current mission and traveling through dangerous territory in complete darkness. Even if he could reach the area, one sniper against 40 or more Taliban fighters seemed like an impossible task. But Rodriguez had sworn an oath to never leave a fellow American behind. He quickly packed his gear, shouldered his specialized sniper rifle, and began moving through the treacherous mountain paths toward the sound of distant gunfire that was about to begin. The race against time had started, and Morrison's team had no idea that help was coming. At exactly midnight, the Taliban attack began with a barrage of rocket-propelled grenades that exploded against the rocks around Morrison's position. The night sky lit up with orange flashes as shrapnel whistled through the air. Morrison's team immediately returned fire, their muzzle flashes revealing their positions to the enemy. The battle was fierce and chaotic. Taliban fighters advanced from 3 directions, using automatic weapons to spray bullets at the SEAL positions. Morrison could hear the distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles mixed with the heavier sound of machine gun fire. His team was well-trained and disciplined, but they were quickly running low on ammunition. Petty Officer Martinez, the team's medic, was hit in the shoulder by shrapnel from an exploding grenade. He gritted his teeth and continued fighting, using his rifle one-handed while Chen helped bandage his wound. The team's demolitions expert, Chief Petty Officer Williams, detonated one of their claymore mines when a group of Taliban fighters got too close. But more enemies kept coming. Rodriguez was still 3 miles away, moving as fast as he could through the treacherous mountain terrain. He could hear the gunfire echoing off the valley walls and see the muzzle flashes lighting up the mountainside like a deadly fireworks display. Using his night vision scope, he studied the battlefield from a distance and began formulating a plan. From his elevated position, Rodriguez could see something that Morrison's team couldn't. The Taliban fighters weren't just attacking randomly. They were following a specific pattern designed to force the SEALs into an even smaller defensive position. Once the Americans were compressed into a tight group, the Taliban would use their heavy weapons to finish them off. Rodriguez identified the key to the entire Taliban attack plan: a heavy machine gun position on a ridge about 800 meters from the SEAL team. The machine gun was providing covering fire for the advancing fighters and preventing the SEALs from maneuvering to better positions. If he could take out that gun position, it might give Morrison's team a fighting chance. The problem was the distance and the darkness. 800 meters was a challenging shot even in daylight, and Rodriguez would only get one chance before revealing his own position to the enemy. He carefully set up his rifle on a stable rock outcropping and began calculating wind speed, bullet drop, and target movement. Meanwhile, Morrison was making desperate decisions as his team's situation deteriorated. They had used half their ammunition, and the Taliban fighters were getting closer with each assault. One of his men had been wounded, and their defensive positions were being systematically destroyed by enemy grenades and rocket attacks. Morrison called for artillery support on his radio, even though he knew the base was too far away to help. He also requested immediate helicopter extraction, but the response was grim. No aircraft could reach them until dawn, and that was still 6 hours away. His team would never last that long against the overwhelming enemy numbers. Chen picked up more enemy radio traffic that made the situation even worse. Taliban reinforcements had arrived and were setting up mortar positions to shell the SEAL team from long range. Once those mortars started firing, Morrison's men would have nowhere to hide among the rocks. Rodriguez finally reached a position where he had a clear line of sight to the Taliban machine gun. Through his high-powered scope, he could see the 2 enemy fighters operating the weapon. They were professional soldiers, not untrained militia, and they had positioned their gun expertly to control the entire battlefield. Rodriguez controlled his breathing and placed his crosshairs on the machine gunner. The shot would be difficult not just because of the distance, but because he needed to time it perfectly with the ongoing battle. If he missed, the muzzle flash from his rifle would reveal his position and bring dozens of enemy fighters down on him. The Taliban machine gun opened fire again, sending a stream of tracer rounds toward the SEAL positions. Rodriguez watched the pattern of fire and waited for the perfect moment. The machine gunner paused to change ammunition belts, presenting a stationary target for just a few seconds. Rodriguez squeezed the trigger gently, and his rifle spoke with a sharp crack that echoed across the mountains. The .338 Lapua Magnum bullet flew through the night air and found its target. The Taliban machine gunner dropped instantly and his weapon fell silent. But Rodriguez's work was just beginning. The second enemy fighter at the gun position looked around in confusion, not understanding what had happened to his partner. Before the man could figure out the threat or restart the machine gun, Rodriguez fired again. A second bullet ended that threat as well. Suddenly, Morrison noticed that the enemy's heavy machine gun had stopped firing. His team was still under attack from rifles and grenades, but the devastating automatic fire that had been pinning them down was gone. Morrison didn't know what had happened, but he seized the opportunity to reorganize his men and improve their defensive positions. Rodriguez smiled grimly as he watched the Taliban fighters become confused and disorganized without their heavy weapon support. But he knew this was just the beginning of a long night, and the enemy would soon figure out that a sniper was hunting them from the darkness. The Taliban fighters quickly realized they were being hunted by an unseen sniper. Their disciplined attack began to falter, as individual fighters became reluctant to expose themselves. Rodriguez had shifted the psychological balance of the battle. Now the hunters were becoming the hunted. Rodriguez moved to a new position after each shot, using his knowledge of the terrain to stay hidden, while maintaining clear sight lines to the enemy. He had trained for years in this type of warfare, learning to become invisible in hostile territory while picking off targets from impossible distances. His next target was a Taliban commander who was trying to coordinate his fighters, using hand signals and shouted orders. Rodriguez watched through his scope as the man moved between rock formations, directing his troops to continue their assault on the SEAL team. The commander was careful to stay in cover, but Rodriguez was patient. When the Taliban commander finally exposed himself to signal a flanking maneuver, Rodriguez was ready. His third shot of the night dropped the man instantly, throwing the enemy attack into further confusion. Without clear leadership, the Taliban fighters began making mistakes and exposing themselves to both Rodriguez's rifle and return fire from Morrison's team. Morrison noticed the change in enemy behavior immediately. The Taliban attacks were becoming less coordinated and more desperate. Individual fighters were breaking from cover and running between positions, giving his SEALs clear targets. Morrison didn't know who was helping them, but he was grateful for whatever was disrupting the enemy assault. Chen picked up radio chatter indicating that the Taliban fighters were becoming afraid. They were reporting to their commanders that their men were being killed by ghost shots from an unknown location. Some of the fighters were beginning to question whether they should continue the attack or withdraw to safer positions. Rodriguez identified his next priority target: a Taliban fighter armed with a rocket-propelled grenade who was preparing to fire at the SEAL positions. The RPG would cause devastating casualties if it found its mark. Rodriguez tracked the man through his scope as the fighter raised his weapon and aimed at Morrison's team. The shot was extremely difficult because the RPG gunner was partially hidden behind a large boulder. With only his head and shoulders visible, Rodriguez had to account for the man's movement as he prepared to fire, the irregular wind patterns in the mountain valley, and the fact that his target was about to trigger a weapon that could kill multiple Americans. Rodriguez fired just as the Taliban fighter squeezed his trigger. Both weapons fired almost simultaneously, but Rodriguez's bullet arrived first. The enemy RPG gunner fell backward, and his rocket flew harmlessly over the SEAL positions to explode against a distant cliff face. By now, Morrison was beginning to understand that someone was providing sniper support from an unknown location. The enemy casualties were too precise and well-timed to be coincidental. Morrison tried calling on his radio to identify their mystery helper, but got no response. Whoever was helping them was maintaining radio silence. Rodriguez continued his deadly work, systematically picking off Taliban fighters who posed the greatest threat to the SEAL team. He targeted machine gunners, RPG operators, and anyone carrying heavy weapons. Each shot was carefully planned and executed, with Rodriguez moving to a new firing position after each kill to avoid being located by the enemy. The Taliban fighters were becoming increasingly demoralized as their casualties mounted without them being able to identify or engage their attacker. Rodriguez was using classic sniper tactics, taking advantage of the psychological impact of precision fire from an invisible enemy. Fear was spreading through the Taliban ranks. However, Rodriguez faced his own challenges. He was running low on ammunition for his specialized rifle, and he was operating alone without any support. If the Taliban fighters managed to locate his position, he would be overwhelmed by superior numbers. Every shot he took increased the risk of being discovered. Meanwhile, the Taliban mortar team had finally gotten their weapons set up and began shelling the SEAL positions. The first mortar rounds exploded close enough to shower Morrison's team with rocks and debris. Chen reported that she could hear the enemy adjusting their fire, walking the explosions closer to the American positions. Rodriguez knew he had to act quickly. The mortar team was about 1,200 meters away, at the very edge of his rifle's effective range. The shot would be extremely difficult, but if those mortars found their mark, Morrison's team would be wiped out regardless of how many individual fighters Rodriguez eliminated. Using his scope, Rodriguez studied the distant mortar position. He could see 3 Taliban fighters working the weapon, one loading rounds, one adjusting elevation, and one calculating range. Rodriguez would need to take out the key man operating the mortar to stop the barrage. The distance was so great that Rodriguez had to account for significant bullet drop and travel time. He also had to time his shot perfectly because the mortar operator was constantly moving as he worked his weapon. Rodriguez waited patiently, controlling his breathing and heart rate as he prepared for the most difficult shot of his career. A mortar round exploded just 20 meters from Morrison's position, close enough that the blast wave knocked 2 of his men flat against the rocks. The next round would likely be a direct hit. Rodriguez knew he was out of time. He placed his crosshairs on the Taliban mortar operator and began his final breathing sequence. Everything depended on this one shot. The lives of 8 Navy SEALs and his own survival hung in the balance as his finger tightened on the trigger. Rodriguez squeezed the trigger and watched through his scope as the bullet traveled across the vast distance. The shot seemed to take forever, and for a moment he thought he had missed. Then the Taliban mortar operator suddenly collapsed, and the deadly weapon fell silent, just as it was being prepared to fire again. The other 2 enemy fighters at the mortar position looked around in panic, trying to understand what had happened to their teammate. Rodriguez quickly worked the bolt on his rifle and fired again, taking down the man who was reaching for the mortar controls. The third fighter ran for cover, abandoning the weapon entirely. Morrison felt a wave of relief as the mortar bombardment stopped. His team was still taking rifle fire from the remaining Taliban fighters, but the threat of devastating explosions raining down on them had been eliminated. Chen reported that enemy radio chatter was becoming increasingly desperate and disorganized. With their heavy weapons neutralized and their leadership eliminated, the Taliban attack began to collapse. Rodriguez had systematically removed the key elements that made the enemy assault effective. Individual fighters were still dangerous, but they no longer had the coordination and firepower needed to overwhelm the SEAL team. Rodriguez decided to make his presence known to the Americans. He used his laser rangefinder to paint a target on a Taliban fighter who was about to throw a grenade at Morrison's position. The laser was visible to anyone wearing night vision equipment, and Rodriguez hoped the SEALs would understand the signal. Morrison saw the laser dot appear on the enemy fighter and immediately understood that their mysterious helper was marking targets for them. He signaled his team, and they focused their fire on the marked Taliban fighter, eliminating him before he could throw his grenade. Morrison keyed his radio and whispered, "Unknown sniper, if you can hear this, mark your next target." Rodriguez smiled and moved his laser to another enemy position where 2 Taliban fighters were preparing to assault the SEAL team with automatic weapons. Morrison's men immediately engaged the marked target, and Rodriguez watched with satisfaction as coordinated American firepower eliminated the threat. This new tactic was devastatingly effective. Rodriguez used his elevated position and night vision scope to identify threats that the SEALs couldn't see from their defensive positions. By marking targets with his laser, he turned Morrison's team into a precision weapon that could engage enemies anywhere on the battlefield. The psychological impact on the Taliban fighters was enormous. Not only were they being hunted by an invisible sniper, but now the American team seemed to have supernatural ability to target them in the darkness. Fighters who thought they were safely hidden behind rocks suddenly found themselves under accurate fire from multiple directions. Rodriguez continued marking targets, while also taking his own shots when the opportunity arose. He was now down to his last 5 rounds of ammunition, so every bullet had to count. He saved his remaining shots for the most critical targets while using his laser to coordinate the SEAL team's fire against lesser threats. As dawn began to approach, the surviving Taliban fighters started withdrawing from their positions. They had lost more than half their force, including all their leaders and heavy weapons operators. The carefully planned ambush had turned into a disaster, and the remaining fighters had no stomach for continuing the battle. Morrison watched through his night vision as enemy muzzle flashes became fewer and more distant. The intensity of incoming fire decreased dramatically, and Chen reported that Taliban radio traffic was now focused on organizing a retreat rather than continuing the attack. Rodriguez saw his opportunity to make contact with the SEAL team. Using hand signals that would be visible through night vision equipment, he identified his position on a ridge about 600 meters from Morrison's team. He then used his laser to write a simple message in the air, USMC Rodriguez. Morrison nearly shouted with relief when he saw the message. Rodriguez was an American, which explained the professional precision of the sniper fire that had saved their lives. Morrison immediately tried to establish radio contact, and Rodriguez finally responded on an encrypted military frequency. SEAL team, this is Rodriguez. You have about 20 tangos withdrawing to the east. Suggest you maintain defensive positions until daylight when extraction can arrive safely. Rodriguez's voice was calm and professional, despite having fought through the entire night. Morrison responded, "Rodriguez, you saved our lives tonight. How many men are you working with?" There was a pause before Rodriguez answered, and Morrison could hardly believe the response. "SEAL team, I'm operating alone. Suggest we maintain distance until positive identification can be established at first light. Taliban may attempt counterattack if they receive reinforcements." Morrison stared at his radio in amazement. One man had turned the tide of an entire battle, eliminating the key threats that would have wiped out his entire team. Rodriguez had fought with skill and courage that went beyond anything Morrison had seen in his years of special operations. As the first hints of dawn appeared in the eastern sky, both the SEALs and Rodriguez prepared for the possibility that the Taliban might make one final attempt to salvage their failed ambush. But Chen's radio intercepts suggested that the enemy was more focused on escaping than fighting, and the mountain battlefield was finally becoming quiet. As the sun rose over the Afghan mountains, Morrison got his first clear look at the battlefield, where his team had nearly died. The rocky terrain was littered with Taliban casualties and abandoned weapons. Spent shell casings glinted in the morning light, telling the story of the fierce battle that had raged through the darkness. Rodriguez made his way down from his sniper position, moving carefully through the terrain where enemy fighters might still be hiding. When he finally reached Morrison's defensive position, the SEAL commander was shocked by what he saw. Rodriguez looked exhausted but alert, carrying a specialized sniper rifle and wearing gear that showed he had been operating alone in hostile territory for weeks. Morrison extended his hand to Rodriguez with genuine gratitude. "Marine, I don't know how to thank you. We counted at least 15 enemy casualties from your position alone. How did you manage all of that by yourself?" Rodriguez shook Morrison's hand firmly. "Just doing my job, sir. Heard your distress call and couldn't leave fellow Americans behind." Despite his modest words, it was clear that Rodriguez had performed far beyond the call of duty during the night. Battle Chen had been monitoring radio traffic and reported that the Taliban survivors had indeed retreated completely from the area. No enemy reinforcements were moving toward their position, and the immediate threat was over. The failed ambush had cost the Taliban dearly in both men and equipment. The original target of Morrison's mission, Ahmed Nazir, had escaped during the confusion of the battle. The bomb maker had used the cover of the firefight to slip away from his compound, and he was now somewhere in the vast mountain wilderness. But Morrison knew that saving his team's lives was more important than capturing any single target. Rodriguez provided Morrison with valuable intelligence about Taliban movement patterns in the region. During his weeks of solo operations, he had mapped enemy supply routes and identified several other high-value targets. This information would help future missions avoid the kind of trap that Morrison's team had walked into. 2 hours after sunrise, extraction helicopters arrived to evacuate both the SEAL team and Rodriguez. The helicopter crews were amazed by the evidence of the night battle, the precision of Rodriguez's shooting and the tactical skill both forces had shown in surviving against overwhelming odds. During the flight back to base, Morrison learned more about Rodriguez's background. The Marine had volunteered for an experimental program designed to test whether individual snipers could operate effectively for extended periods in hostile territory. The program was classified, which explained why nobody at the base had known about Rodriguez's presence in the area. Colonel Martinez debriefed both Morrison and Rodriguez extensively about the events of the night. The intelligence gained from their experiences would be used to improve tactics and procedures for future operations. The Taliban's ability to set up such an elaborate ambush indicated that enemy intelligence capabilities were more sophisticated than previously believed. Rodriguez was recommended for the Navy Cross for his actions during the battle. The citation noted that his precision shooting and tactical coordination with the SEAL team had prevented what would have been a significant loss of American lives. Morrison also received recognition for his leadership in keeping his team together under impossible circumstances. The aftermath of the battle had wider implications for military operations in the region. The Taliban had lost a significant number of experienced fighters and heavy weapons, weakening their ability to conduct future ambushes. The successful coordination between Rodriguez and Morrison's team also provided valuable lessons about integrating lone snipers with traditional unit operations. 6 months later, Morrison and Rodriguez met again at a military ceremony, where both men received their decorations. They had maintained contact since the battle, and Morrison had requested that Rodriguez be assigned to support his future missions when possible. The partnership that had been forged in desperate combat had proven its value. Ahmed Nazir, the bomb maker who had originally been their target, was eventually captured in a different operation 3 months later. Intelligence gathered from the night battle had helped other units track his movements and predict his hiding places. Justice had been delayed, but not denied. Rodriguez continued his solo sniper operations for another year before being promoted and assigned to train other Marines in advanced reconnaissance techniques. His experiences operating alone in hostile territory had provided valuable insights into tactics that were being incorporated into military doctrine. Morrison returned to the United States for a brief assignment, before deploying again with a new SEAL team. He often spoke about the night in the Afghan mountains when one man's courage and skill had saved 8 lives. The story became legendary within the special operations community. The bond between the SEAL team and their mysterious savior remained strong years after the battle. They had experienced something that only warriors can truly understand: the knowledge that someone had risked everything to save their lives when death seemed certain. In the brotherhood of combat, there is no greater honor than knowing someone would answer your distress call no matter what the cost.